Hi, I'm David Gregg, the director of the Rhode Island Natural History Survey, and you're watching a recording of the 2025 Lisa Lofland Gould Native Plant Program. This was recorded December 6, 2025, and the speaker is Kosiba. She is an extension forestry professor at the University of Vermont in Burlington. Her topic today is forests in a changing climate. The Gould program is held every year, and it's a joint program of the Rhode Island Natural History Survey, the Rhode Island Wild Plant Society, and the URI Master Gardeners. It's funded by an endowment at the Rhode Island Foundation. I hope you enjoy the program, and see you out there.
And to kind of pick up with that thread, I'm going to ask Don DeHaze to come up and introduce our speaker. Don is on the board of the Natural History Survey and a forester himself. Don.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. So great to see this wonderful turnout. Thank you, Ali, for agreeing to make the long journey from the Burlington area of Vermont. This is really actually a special treat for me to be able to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Ali Kosiba. Well, I met Ali earlier today for the first time. We share many common connections through our experiences at the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Vermont. Ali is an ecophysiologist. I expect she'll tell you what that is when she starts talking. And an extension assistant professor at UVM. She earned both her master's and her PhD in the Rubenstein School at UVM. I was on the faculty in that school for many, many years and served as the founding dean of the Rubenstein School at UVM before coming to the University of Rhode Island in 2008 to become provost here. As I found out, we even worked on some common projects related to red spruce decline, and we worked with many of the same colleagues over time. So this is really special for me to be able to build that connection and rekindle it. In many ways, this is sort of a circle of life interconnection to our work and our experiences. But Ali's actually done a heck of a lot more than I ever did when I was there. She leads the Extension Forestry program at UVM. She also serves as the state extension forester, as a regional educator on forest science, forest carbon science, and she leads the Vermont Forest Carbon Inventory. Her work focuses on bridging research and practice, helping landowners and professionals in the public writ large understand forest ecology and sustainable management. Her expertise centers, and she's going to talk about some of this today, on climate change impacts in trees and forests, climate adaptive forest management, forest carbon science and management, forest ecosystem health challenges, and forest ecophysiology. Today she'll be discussing how climate change is reshaping our forests, describing how climate-driven shifts are already underway, affecting tree physiology, health and survival, and broader forest ecosystem responses. So without further ado, let me welcome to the platform Dr. Ali Kosiba.
I'm going to use this because I also need to use the clicker. Let's see if, does this work? Yeah. Okay, great, because then I use the clicker on the other side. So thanks everyone for coming out. It's so lovely to see so many people coming out on a cold, rainy Saturday, and thanks for the invite to come down here to Rhode Island. I am in Vermont, but I see my region is really New England, New York, so I'm always happy to come down in southern New England and get to see some cool new tree species, not new, but ones we don't have a lot of up in Vermont, so that's pretty exciting. All right, so I'm just gonna get into it. I wasn't gonna talk about what a forest ecophysiologist is, but now I feel like I need to. Really, it's just a marrying of tree physiologists, so how do trees work, how do they function, and forest ecologists. So really, I think about the trees first. I am a huge just fan of trees, how they work, how they function, but recognize trees are part of broader ecosystems. There are insects, birds, soil, fungi, water, air, all these parts of a forest that trees are really integral to. So that's really what that term really means. So I think about the trees first, and you'll see that in a lot of my work and a lot of what I'm talking about today, but it has implications to all these other functions and benefits that forests provide us. All right, so, just to set the stage, I'm sure this isn't a surprise to a lot of you, but our climate is changing. And we've seen this in long-term records. This is the region, again, that region I refer to as New England, New York is often what I talk about. We've seen a 3-degree increase in our annual average temperature since 1970. And of course, that's projected to increase. We don't know really what the magnitude of that increase will be. It depends on the future emissions that we see. So here in Rhode Island, that actually means that today's climate is much like what Maryland was in the first half of the 20th century. And looking forward, it's what South Carolina is like now. That would be the future climate of Rhode Island at the end of this century. So those are big changes, right? Especially when you think of plant ranges and where different plants grow, which will be something I talk about. We also see in terms of plant response and trees, growing season has lengthened, right? Those warmer temperatures mean that the first or the last frost in the spring is coming earlier, and the first frost in the fall is coming later. And on average, it's about 2 weeks. You see there's some variability amongst the states in the region, but that's a lengthening of the growing season. We're also seeing, of course, that winters are more mild. One really interesting phenomenon about climate change is that cold things, so cold entities, that can mean minimum temperatures, winters, northern areas are warming faster than other entities. So we're seeing mountains are warming faster than valleys. New England is warming faster than other parts of the countries you see here. And so we're seeing a really significant increase in our winter temperature. One impact of this, and if you're a plant lover, you know this, our plant hardiness zones have changed, right? So here in Rhode Island, maybe you're used to what they were a couple decades ago, which was zone 6A to 7A, right? So temperatures getting below freezing, right around freezing would be your minimum winter temperature expected. We've already seen new hardiness zone maps bump up about 5 degrees. So we're still seeing some below zero temperatures, minimum winter temperatures, but they're certainly warmer. And the forecast is for these to continue to increase. Again, we don't really know the magnitude, depends on emissions, but they could increase quite a bit. And even at the end of the century, minimum winter temperatures might be just barely below freezing. So thinking about what the implications of that are for the plants that can grow here in Rhode Island, the insects, all the other parts of life. So just for context, doesn't mean we won't have oaks, maples, all the species you have here, but it does mean species like southern magnolia can tolerate that zone, that range. Species that really would have been normally, it's too cold here, could maybe survive. So we're also seeing with climate change, we're getting more heat stress, right? So the number of days that are hot, and this is using a metric that's 86 degrees Fahrenheit. That's, not really that hot for a plant, but it is a good metric to show stress for animals, insects, plants, and humans. And so what we see if we forecast this in the future, again, these are models. We don't really know what the future will bring, but a significant increase in the number of days that are in the upper 80s and 90s. And one of the concerns I have with this is that warmer air temperatures hold more water. So the air can actually hold more water. So what we see is we get more evaporation of water from soils, from surfaces, from leaves. And we get dry soils, we have drought stress in conditions that maybe we previously wouldn't have. But now with warmer temperatures, we have more evaporation. And we saw this here in northern New England this past September, October, and actually is continuing into November, as we had severe drought. It doesn't look like you had as much of it here in Rhode Island, but it wasn't, particularly droughty conditions. We just didn't get a lot of precipitation, but the air temperatures were really warm. We had a lot of evaporation, particularly in places with shallow soils, with sandy soils that don't hold a lot of water. And we actually saw, it started in probably late August, some trees started showing crinkled brown leaves. And some of those leaves fell to the ground early. So I got lots of emails, lots of calls. What's going on? It is drought stress, and it is an adaptation that trees have. Deciduous trees will lose those leaves. But we saw this happening on south-facing slopes, really dry sites, pretty much throughout northern New England. And then we have this other side of the spectrum, right? Wetter conditions, and I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this. We've had a number of flood events in Vermont in the last decade. It seems like almost every year in the summer, we have an extreme rain event that causes some damage somewhere. And it is true, we are seeing more heavy rainfall events. And so you can measure these in different ways, above 2 inches, 3 inches, 4. What's interesting is that we're seeing a really big increase in these 4 or 5 inch precipitation events, an increase of 103%, right? And so 5 inches is a good amount of rain coming in one event. And the forecast is for that to continue, that we are gonna see more heavy rain events. And that might seem, not to align with this idea of drought. The idea is we're gonna get more rain coming in punctuated events, and then longer periods of time between those events. With warmer air, we could actually have a lot of evaporation of that water. And then it's just a general idea of more volatility in our weather. And folks have used this term weather whiplash. It's like, we get drought, then we get deluge. That we're seeing things like maybe increased forest fire that accompanies some of these droughts. We're seeing things, maybe more ice events that cause branch breakage. And certainly one thing I'll note is some phenomenon where we have early spring leaf out and then we get a cold snap. And so just these kind of, really volatile events that happen, extreme weather events that can stress trees. All right, so I set the stage. I do want to talk a little bit about, well, what does this mean for trees? How do trees respond to these changes? And I just want to say that trees are incredibly adaptable. I mean, they have so many adaptations that help them deal with huge temperature variations, changes in their environment. And they are what we call plastic. That's a term we use in the science community to talk about species or organisms that can adapt to different conditions, right? If you think about it, a tree can survive negative 20-degree weather and 100-degree weather. And so a couple examples of these really cool adaptations that trees have, they can deal with stress, is they can actually regulate water loss. And I'll talk about this, but trees have little pores on their leaves. That's what allows for gas exchange for them to take in carbon dioxide from the air that they use in photosynthesis to make carbohydrates. But they can shut those little pores down and reduce the water loss that would come out of those pores. So in times of drought, trees will do that, and they will hunker down and reduce their water loss until water is more available. Trees can produce defense chemicals if an insect outbreak is threatening them. Even if a neighboring tree is having an insect outbreak, they can produce defense chemicals in response. And they can do things like compartmentalize, which means warding off areas of wounding if they are wounded by a beetle or larva tunneling through their wood. We see this with tapping sugar maple. When we put in the tap and remove it, sugar maple is exceptionally good about warding out or compartmentalizing that area so that fungi and bacteria don't go to the rest of the tree. They can do things like adjusting where their roots are to find more water, or where there's not water, or there's more nutrients or fewer nutrients. And so little fine feeder roots will die and then be rebuilt at really fast timescales to adjust to those conditions. We'll even see in times of drought that trees will put more of their energy into building roots rather than building branches and above ground components, because finding water is more critical during drought. They can do things like modifying the shape, the number, the thickness of their leaves depending on the conditions. So we see that a lot too, that a same species of tree growing in different environments might look really different. It might still look like a red maple, but the lobes might be deeper where it's drier or warmer. Trees have what we call dormant buds all over their branches, on their stems, and when something happens to their canopy, so say they lose the top of their canopy or branches, those buds can then sprout and create new branches and leaves. We call those epicormics, and so it's a really amazing adaptation. You've probably seen this. A tree loses part of its canopy and then a new branch will take over. It can basically regrow the crown. And trees have they have high redundancy. They're not like us or a lot of other organisms that have central organs. They can lose a branch, part of their roots. They can have hollow stem. A trunk can be completely hollowed out and still survive. And what this allows them to do is not suffer mortality if they lose part of their canopy or if an insect eats part of their structure. And what we do see too in a single tree, because of this lack of centralized organs, you can actually have genetic diversity that varies throughout the tree. Because each branch stem, bud, is a meristem, and those can have mutations. And so then the seed or the pollen that arises from this branch can be different from that branch. So it's pretty cool that you can have this amazing genetic variability within a tree that just develops over time. And then when we look at sort of the population or species level, there's also adaptations. And this is something I'm going to talk about in a few more slides. Species shift their ranges. If conditions are not suitable where they are, their range will constrict or expand to find places that are more suitable. Of course, an individual tree can't pick up and move, but they will do that through offspring from seeds, seedlings, and saplings, and species will slowly move across the landscape. And they've done this before. We had glaciers that covered a lot of our area, and species moved back in. They rearranged where they live, and they're constantly doing this, maybe not at a time frame that we can visualize easily. Of course, they produce a lot of seeds. This is another strategy that they have. Thousands and thousands of seeds that are dispersed by wind, by water, by animals that can travel fairly far distances, so they're pretty good at getting to new locations. They also have some other helpful relationships with fungi. We call these mycorrhizal fungi. They're fungi that associate with tree roots, other plant roots too, but trees have these relationships. They allow trees to colonize new locations, maybe places that don't have a lot of water or nutrients. Those fungi help trees access water and nutrients in the soil. And then within a tree species, there's a lot of genetic diversity. Trees are very diverse species compared to some other organisms. So that means different populations within a species might have different responses to the same climate variables. So we can get success maybe from one population and another population might not do as well. So the expectation, and I'll talk about whether we're seeing this or not in a little bit, is that we're going to see ranges of tree species change. So imagine this blob is a tree species current range. So on that southern edge of the range, with a warming climate, that will be more stressful, just because the temperature is going to be warmer. And we could see this also at lower elevations as well. So south-facing sites, might be drier, places that are just more stressful, so we call these marginal sites. Maybe that species it's not their preferred location. We'll also see more stress there. And so what can happen is we get what we call range constriction. And again, this isn't the individual trees, but they'll move through migration. The trees in the southern range might not do as well. They might suffer health declines. Maybe their seed is not viable. Maybe they don't produce as much seed, or they don't flower as much. Maybe those seedlings have a harder time establishing and competing against the other trees. And so we see this slow march northward or up in elevation. At the same time, we can see range expansion into more favorable locations, north, up slope. And you can see, this is an example of a species with a contiguous range. So we do worry about species that have very narrow, small ranges, or those species that are in really specific habitats, right? That those habitats might not be well linked with each other. And so the ability of those species to move to more northerly or cooler environments might be challenged. And I'll give some examples of other challenges that trees face. So looking at what tools we have this amazing tool by the US Forest Service called the Climate Change Tree Atlas that helps us understand possible tree range shifts with climate change. And this is actually for Rhode Island. I pulled the data for Rhode Island, and you can access this yourself if you just put in your search bar, Climate Change Tree Atlas Rhode Island. They have this 2-pager that's great and really helpful. And it's, again, all this stuff, these are projections. These are models that help, they are there to help us with decision making and planning and stewardship. But what I want to show you here is that they're divided into these 3 categories. So it's a combination of the range shift, but also the how adaptable that species is. I'll talk about what that means, but we have these 3 buckets, right? So we have a group of species we think has a poor capability to endure future climate change here in Rhode Island. We have a mixed group that's mixed fair, and then we have a group that's good. And what I want to show, point out here is that good list is very long, right? We have a lot of species here in New England. We have a lot of species that have really good adaptations to change. And so it's not that we're going to lose all of these iconic species we're used to. It's just some of these might be a little bit more stressed. And really those are species that like colder environments or might have some vulnerabilities to some of the stressors we're seeing along with climate change. So I'll give an example, kind of 2 opposites. These are the ones I often talk about as the poster children of climate change. Balsam fir, very cold adapted species, and then northern red oak. Exists in lots of different places, likes warm climates, is very tolerant of drought. And I'll show you what this looks like. So balsam fir, love balsam fir. It is very limited to northern New England, and actually its range goes well up into Canada. Of course, we don't always share data with Canada, so this makes it look like it stops at the border. But this is what its range actually looks like, right? It goes well up into Labrador, really, really cold climates. And up in some of these forests, it exists, only with spruce. Up in here, it's white spruce or black spruce, very, very cold hardy species. It is a boreal conifer. So you'll see it doesn't exist much more south than where we are. It does not like warm climates. And so what we can see here, this is from the Climate Change Tree Atlas, and I'll walk you through what this is, but I think it's a helpful way to think about how trees respond to different climates, how unique and individual each species is. So these are examples here, these different colors, are where balsam fir grows. And it uses this metric importance value. It's a combination of how many trees of balsam fir are at that location and how big they are. So if we have dark blue, that means it's a great site for balsam fir, right? You see that northern Maine, great habitat for balsam fir. Northern New Hampshire, great habitat. Likes those conditions. And if we take each one of these locations and we put them on a climate map, so this is climate envelope, we call it, or climate niche. Precipitation and temperature, we can map out the range of conditions based on those two variables that balsam fir exists at and lives at currently. And so what we see, this is the average temperature of Rhode Island in 1895, right? Balsam fir is not a species that we have a lot of. Its range doesn't even extend down here. There are some dots of balsam fir. You know, it's really too warm here for it, and that's reflected in this line here, right above its favorable temperature. And then when we look at the average temperature now, you know, we're very far away from that climate niche that balsam fir really likes. When we look at precipitation, oh, here we go. Precipitation back in 1895. Now, precipitation is not a big driver for this species. Really is temperature. It likes those cold temperatures. And I did mention the Canadian habitat. This climate niche would actually go much further down below this graph, a lot colder temperatures. Right? We're really at the southern edge of balsam fir's range. And so this is what the forecasted habitat looks like. And I'll just toggle back. So this is what its current habitat is. Forecasted. So we're not going to lose it from northern New England, but you see that southern part of its range is going to be constricted, and it might lose some importance value even in its core habitat in New England, and that just means it's going to be a little more stressed. It might not be able to compete as well with other species. It also has an adaptability that's fairly low, and this is because it's very sensitive to several insect pests. It's sensitive to fire, it's sensitive to wind throw, to ice loading. It doesn't like temperature gradients. It's just a species that likes certain locations, and that's just where it grows, and it's not happy outside of those, and it does have a lot of vulnerabilities. So this is a pretty vulnerable species here in New England. We contrast that to northern red oak, right? Right away you see this range of red oak. Much bigger, much more expansive. It doesn't have areas where it's extremely dominant like balsam fir can exist in almost pure balsam fir stands, but it can exist across a huge range of locations, climates, latitude, longitude, and doing the same climate envelope, you see it's just much longer, right? A much bigger temperature gradient that species exists at. And same exercise, past climate of Rhode Island, right now, solidly in that climate envelope for northern red oak, right? We're not going to lose northern red oak here. It will solidly be a species that we have and that persists into the future. Different to balsam fir, though, is that red oak's a little bit narrower in that precipitation range. Right? And we see the precipitation now has increased from what it was in the past. You know, we are getting a little bit potentially too wet for the species. I don't think this will be a huge issue for northern red oak, but it's just something interesting to note that there are different ranges across these climate variables. And this is what the forecasted range of red oak will be, again, toggling back and forth. And there is some difference in the shading here, right, because these are current locations based on inventory. This is sort of modeled. But you'll see, right, it's still going to exist in all these places. One big change is this northern limit, that we might have red oak in central and northern Maine, which it really does not exist up in those places, or in northern Vermont and New Hampshire. There is some, and I hear a lot from landowners that are finding red oak seedlings in their woods, right? So we're seeing some of that change happening. It has a really high adaptability score, 5.4. It can grow huge temperature gradients. It can sprout. If the stem is damaged, it can sprout from the roots. It is very tolerant of fire. It can recover after fire. Its biggest issue is insects, so spongy moth, namely, and oak wilt are two vulnerabilities that it has. But other than that, it's a very resilient, adaptable species. So also here in Rhode Island, true everywhere, we could have some species that find new habitats that aren't species that are currently native to the area, but maybe exist just south of us. And so this is a pretty long list of potential species that we could see have future habitats here. And so again, this is that idea of their ranges expanding north. So one example pulling out is sweet gum, which is a cool tree, and I actually did see some planted ones around here, so it clearly survives here, and we even have it north of here, it can be planted. But its range really ends kind of in like Long Island area, right? It's much more of a southern species. But when we look at the future climate or range of this species under future climate change, right, having it extend actually up into my neck of the woods in the Champlain Valley, up into southern New Hampshire and southern Maine. Very interesting. And I'll talk about at the end, like what we can think about and what our actions are. Will species actually be able to move to these new locations is a big question, but those habitats will be favorable to them. When we look at adaptability, fairly high for sweet gum. One of the things that sweet gum needs is full sunlight. So for a species like sweet gum to expand its range north, it needs canopy gaps and full sun. It will not do well coming in the understory of a forest. So this is just something, if we want to promote this natural migration and reordering of forest species, sometimes species need specific conditions to establish. Other than that, it's a pretty resilient species, and so it is a good one to think about when we think about a changing climate. However, I do want to, preface, we think about range shifts and range migration, there's a lot of wild cards. And we use this phrase that climate change is a threat multiplier for all these other stressors that our forests are already facing. And some of these we don't really know how they will interact. It's complex. And so this is a part that we, as stewards of forests, need to consider some of these interactive stressors. So, example is our earthworms are not native, and some of our forests have non-native earthworms, and these can exacerbate drought stress. They can exacerbate nutrient limitations in soil. So if we have a site that has earthworms versus one that doesn't, the ones that have earthworms might show signs of stress earlier than a site that doesn't. Another concern I have is interactions between climate change and our very interesting and complex land use history that we have here in New England, right? Our forests are, young to middle-aged. They're pretty simple. They have some legacies of that past land use that might make it hard for species to move around and migrate and find new locations. We have things like altered hydrology from some of this past land use or soil compaction. And so it's just something really important to layer on. Every location I go to, I think about the land use history of that site, because that is so important, what the forest looks like now and what the forest will look like in the future. And trees, for the most part, don't die of one individual cause. They actually often die of interacting, overlapping stressors. And so this is an important thing that we can use to understand a steward forest. If we can reduce some of these stressors, we can give trees a better chance. But it is something that makes it complex. And we actually call this a tree decline concept or complex. And this is something I modified from this great book by Mannion that was published in 1980. Still a really, really valuable way to think about forest decline and potential mortality in trees. And what we see here is that climate change itself, even if it's not causing visible stress to a species or a tree, can be a predisposing stress. So that means it can make it more vulnerable. It sort of weakens its systems, makes it more vulnerable to maybe an insect defoliation or to a drought effect, a really punctuated event. And then we can have things like other stressors that sort of opportunistic that come in after that tree has already been weakened. So you can see this kind of spiral of multiple stressors that can cause decline. And so this gets into, at the end, I'll talk about things we can do, and part of it is thinking about how we can reduce some of these stressors and reduce their impacts. All right, so I now want to talk a little bit about what we see in the science. Like what are we seeing from research and monitoring in terms of trees in our region? I there's no way I can cover all of it. Like there's so much, we have so many species, so many locations. Scientists have been studying this for decades. Some of it's conflicting, right? But I'll touch on a few of these aspects that we look at, so hopefully gives you a snapshot of understanding what we're seeing, but also maybe of the complexities of this science and of these responses for trees. So first, I want to talk about we are seeing some benefits of changing climate on trees. That longer growing season does give trees more time to grow. This is an example, and Don DeHaze brought this up, as red spruce. It's a species that's near and dear to my heart. Really lovely. I love red spruce so much. People think it's a boreal conifer like balsam fir because it often grows with balsam fir, but it's a temperate conifer. Its range, comparing that to balsam fir, actually extends quite far down into the central Appalachians, and it doesn't extend way up into Canada. So it's a species that actually likes temperate conditions. When you get really cold or high elevation, like Mount Washington in New Hampshire, it gets replaced by much more cold-tolerant black spruce. And I use dendrochronology, which is tree ring science, to look at growth of red spruce. It's a really cool science because you take this small auger and you take out this pencil-sized piece of the tree, and in one data collection point, you get hundreds of years of data. Well, if the tree is decades to hundreds of years of data. Really, really cool. And you can align these tree rings with 100% accuracy. It takes a lot of skill to do that, but you can align them with 100% accuracy to years. So we can align each one of these rings with its calendar year. And what that allows you to do is then compare those rings to climate, to environmental variables, to insect outbreaks, all sorts of things. And what I saw when I did this across sort of the New England region is that red spruce were growing very well. So this is what we call chronology, and the growth at the end of this chronology in more recent years is much higher than the rest of that chronology. And this has all been statistically standardized to remove a lot of other effects. And so what I found when I looked at the climate relations, there was a lot of things going on here, but one of them was that these warm shoulder seasons, sort of outside the traditional growing season, very warm early spring, even winter thaws, and warm late fall temperatures were benefiting red spruce. It has a really great ability to photosynthesize pretty easily when there are warm, favorable conditions. And it did that. It's capitalizing on those temperatures. The trees maybe it grows with that are deciduous don't have any leaves, and it's in full sun. And we see that the trees are actually being able to grow better, put that photosynthesis into work, into more growth. Another potential benefit that we're seeing from climate change is that climate change is caused by more carbon dioxide in the air. And trees use carbon dioxide in photosynthesis to make carbohydrates. And so we actually see some benefits from that increased carbon dioxide in the air. So trees can photosynthesize more. They maybe can grow more, although I will say we're not seeing that in the research. We are seeing increased photosynthesis, but not translating directly to growth. We can see things that it can shift and make photosynthesis more efficient, even at high temperatures or under low light conditions, which is pretty incredible. And then one thing we are seeing as an outcome is that it's allowing trees to be more efficient with their water loss. So remember I talked about these pores, these stomata that allow carbon dioxide to come in. They allow water vapor to be lost. It's just a natural cost of photosynthesis. And it helps to pull water from the roots up to the canopy, so it's really important. And I mentioned that trees can close those and open them depending on conditions. So with more carbon dioxide in the air, trees can actually close those, preserve water, and still have the same amount of carbon dioxide that they brought in, right? So they don't need to keep those stomata open for as long. So it's more efficient carbon capture for water use. And we are seeing this. This is research around the globe, that there is this increase in water use efficiency among a lot of different species locations. It is stronger in drier sites or in drier conditions, which makes sense when trees are really conserving that water. But this is a strong impact we're seeing across biomes. Of course, there are other, not good impacts. We are seeing detrimental impacts of climate change on several species. I brought up balsam fir, this, really cold-loving species, and we are seeing some of the first examples of direct climate impacts to this species and its southern edge of its range. So folks had noticed, even in Vermont we had this happen, and up in Quebec and New Hampshire, die-off. Browning of balsam fir foliage should be evergreen. We saw this die-off and mortality of these trees. And researchers have correlated this die-off to really warm spring temperatures followed by drought. And so that's just a 1-2 punch for balsam fir that it ends up desiccating and drying out in those conditions. Warm spring temperatures are also causing our deciduous trees to leaf out early. These are data down here in this lower, left side. This is from the National Phenology Network, which is a great site. If you aren't familiar with it, you can look around at long-term monitoring data. This is showing sugar maple leaf out. And what you have at the bottom, you probably can't read that, but it's spring temperature. So as warmer spring temperatures means earlier leaf out would make sense. And so we're seeing that in a number of species. I also did a study where we artificially warmed these poor little seedlings. And we saw that in warmer air temperatures, so we're warming the air around them, we saw that they leafed out earlier, right? So that's something that's happening. It can be problematic though, and I'll show you an example of what happened in 2023 in April across much of northern New England. So we had a really, really warm April. You can see these are temperatures 5, 7, 10 degrees above normal April temperatures. So trees started leafing out and things were becoming really green really early. Normally that would be very late April where I live in Vermont, even May. And then, May 18th, 2023, we had a cold snap. And this just wasn't a frost, this was a freeze. In some places, the temperatures got down into the low 20s, even teens in some places. And these leaves are in a stage where they're emerging and they're pretty vulnerable. They don't have a lot of cold hardiness at that point, and so they're very easily damaged. And so we saw across sort of New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, I think it got a little bit into Massachusetts as well. We saw widespread frost damage. And so a lot of planted street trees in people's yards were really hit hard because their leaves are fully exposed to the air. So that's an oak there, a bur oak. There was some planted sugar maple that got hit hard. This is an ash. All its leaves were damaged. And American beech actually got really damaged in this event too. And it was really interesting because it was often a lot of these species are species that leaf out later than some of the earlier species. They kind of wait till conditions are favorable, but again, the buds were just breaking, and that was a really vulnerable time for those species. And we saw this across crops too. Apple orchards were really hit hard in this event. We do see on the other side of this spectrum that warm temperatures can delay fall leaf senescence. And so that's again with this heating experiment, we saw that If we heated the air around the seedlings, they stayed green longer. And I get a lot of calls about fall foliage, so this is a thing that's often, it's like, when's peak foliage gonna happen? But fall foliage is a really important time for these trees. We get to observe it, it's beautiful, but this is a physiological process that's happening. Trees are preparing for winter, and they're actually recycling nutrients that are really critical from their leaves and storing it back in the trees. And so there is concern, as this process gets delayed, if temperatures in the fall are really warm and trees are not triggered into this, that we could have something like a cold snap or snow that knocks down those leaves, or as day length gets really, really short, those trees don't have enough time to actually recycle a lot of those nutrients. So it has a potential implication to the health of these trees, not only just for our, lovely New England fall foliage season and leaf peeper season, and of course, all the economic portions of that. Up in the northern part of the region, we're really concerned about a decline in snow. And we, haven't seen this too much yet, and we're actually seeing really good snow this year, which is fabulous. But we are worried about a decline in the amount of snow or maybe the length of the snow season. And I worked on this study in New Hampshire at Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest. We actually went in and shoveled snow out of the forest, which is very silly, but that's what science is sometimes. And what we saw is that shoveling that snow, removing that snow from the forest, caused deeper soil freezing. It caused more volatility in the freeze-thaw events in that soil, and those freeze-thaw events physically break up soil and they damage roots. And the implication of that is that we found that sugar maple growing in these snow removal plots where we remove snow actually grew less following that, because they were responding to those injuries. They were putting a lot of their resources into building new roots and not growing new branches. And the last thing I wanted to talk about, I've been talking about physiology because that's where my heart lies, but when we think about trees moving around, I get this question a lot. Well, are we seeing species relocate and move around? And I will say it's very hard for us to pick this up. It's mixed. We're seeing all sorts of different responses in different studies depending on how people look at it. And so yes and no. So this is an example. I'll kind of walk you through this. A little complex, but this is a study that used inventory data, permanent inventory data that we collected the Forest Service. Incredible program. It's our best forest inventory across the country. Every state has a network of permanent plots. And they looked at whether species were coming up in different places that they hadn't been in the past. And these arrows show the magnitude, the significance of their movement and the direction. So what we're seeing is actually, yes, some species are moving north. We're seeing a lot of westward movement as well, and then some counterintuitive movement, some southern movement. And so what the authors of this paper concluded is that trees are actually responding a lot to precipitation, and they're responding to changes in forest succession and development. So this is a little bit of a legacy of our land use. As our forests develop and change, different species come in at different times. And so it's really hard for us to pick up some of these climate-driven changes when we have this land use component. And I'll talk about what we can do to support this. So yeah, the last part of my talk, I wanted to give folks some hopefully actionable steps we can think about to support trees and forests in a changing climate. So I have 5 steps, different scales, different abilities for folks to participate in them. Number 1, is this keeping forests as forests, maintaining connectivity, right? Species are gonna need ability to move around and migrate as climate changes. Right now, we are dealing with a second wave of forest loss in the region. So we had, abandoned farms, and we gained all this forest land back after a low of about 30 across the region. And you'll see in recent years, and this actually hasn't been updated, but we know that's continued, that we're seeing forest loss. And now it's not for agriculture like it was 100, 200 years ago. it's now for development. And so we're probably not going to get that forest land back once it's converted to another land use. And one thing that does is it fragments the forest. And you can see this in the back Google image here, right? It breaks up the continuity of our forest, and that just makes it a lot harder for species of all types to move around. One thing we have in Vermont, I'm very proud of, I was involved with developing the second version of this. We have Vermont Conservation Design. And it's a spatial data set, so we use a whole bunch of data that are spatial, so they cover the whole state, and we layer them upon each other, and it helps us, helps to inform decision making. And so the goal is we really want to maintain and also enhance an ecologically functional landscape. And so we have things like large forest blocks on here. We have connectivity, areas where species are moving across pinch points or roads. We have things like geological diversity. What's the bedrock and what's the soils like in those places? Are there landforms that are unique that might allow for certain species to exist? We have natural communities, rare natural communities, several other data sets. But it's really meant to be a decision-making tool about how we can maintain that connectivity that allows species to move in a changing climate. Outside of Vermont, there is this really great tool that I will plug, TNC's, the Nature Conservancy's Resilient Land Mapping tool. This is a fabulous tool that does pretty much what that Vermont Conservation Design does. Ours is very Vermont specific, but this does help think about that connectivity, biodiversity value. So it's not only about thinking about conserving those highly resilient areas, but what is missing? Are there places that could be restored or revegetated on those missing areas? So the second step I wanted to talk about, really important changing climate, can we identify refugia for species or for ecosystems or communities? And so what refugia are areas that we think might remain relatively buffered from climate change. And so compared to other places, they might have less extreme temperature changes, so lower minimum or maximum temperature, higher soil moisture, right? A shorter growing season, right? We want to sort of have those cold locations, maybe deeper, more persistent snow, less frequent, less severe forest fires. There's a lot of examples of where these could be, like north-facing slopes, what we call cold air drainages, where cold air just naturally pools down valleys. Places like that, places that are seeps or have persistent groundwater, could likely be these climate refugia. An example of something that we've been doing in Vermont is we're really worried about eastern hemlock. Eastern hemlock is threatened by several insect pests, namely hemlock woolly adelgid, but also hemlock elongate scale, both non-native invasive pests. And then also it's very sensitive to climate change. It loves moisture, does not like drought. And so we got together a team of us to have the first management plan for the conservation of hemlock across the state. It's really a first pass. We're probably going to need to iterate this over time. How do we survey and monitor for hemlock health and decline? How do we prioritize hemlock sites? How do we manage the species and how to restore the species? And one of the things I wanted to talk about, just draw your attention to, is this: we created this prioritization tool. It's really an Excel spreadsheet. It's not fancy, but it allows someone to sort of evaluate the value, biodiversity value, ecological value of hemlock locations. How feasible is it to maintain hemlock on that site? And that helps with decision making, right? Because we can't manage everything the same way, but helps funnel resources and effort into those locations. The third strategy is thinking about reducing stressors. And so we have lots of stressors I mentioned, but emerald ash borer, beech leaf disease, hemlock woolly adelgid that are threatening our forests. Early detection is the best strategy we have. So things that are coming down the pike are really, really important for us to identify and control before they get here. And we do see there's this map by the U.S. Forest Service of risk of trees based on these stressors, insect and disease pests, and it's pretty high in some places, especially here in northern New England. And so we do have management and silvicultural options that people are experimenting with, like for emerald ash borer. We now know that if we can create gaps near healthy, mature, seed-bearing ash, we can regenerate that species. The idea, we want to keep it on the landscape, in the future in perpetuity. And so we want to have young baby ash and middle-aged ash and older ash, so that idea that if the older ash die, we still have those young ones that can exist. For hemlock woolly adelgid, folks down in the central Appalachians and in New York have found thinning around these hemlock trees, opening up to light, giving them more resources, actually allows them a fighting chance against hemlock woolly adelgid. And then we also have things like biocontrol. This is, you can't really see it here, but it's in that little mess is states are releasing things that are predators of some of these pests. So that's the Laricobius beetle that eats hemlock woolly adelgid. So that's really hopeful that will be able to control. It won't be able to get rid of it, but hopefully control the population. We also want to think about invasive plants in the same way. Once they're established, very, very hard to control. We can do it. It takes a lot of work, a lot of effort, but identifying those when they first come into a site and controlling them is really the best option. I am worried in several places that these stands will become no longer forests, but invasive shrublands or sort of herbaceous invasive areas, right? Because if you don't have any small trees, young trees to take over, if the overstory just naturally dies or an event comes through, a disturbance, that is no longer a forest. And we are seeing this example here is ash overstory, and those trees are actually dead and dying, and there's very few native tree species under here. So it's a really big problem that concerns me a lot. And we see in climate change, our region is expected to see more of these invasive plants that come up from sort of south of us. So really early detection and being mindful of monitoring for these is really, really our best course of action. We also have impacts from deer browse. So these are two examples. It's kind of hard to see, but when we put a deer fence, we see that where deer are excluded, we get way more regeneration. We have more herbaceous plants. We have a lot more orchids, things like that we don't have where deer are allowed. And some folks are doing this with natural fences, what we call slash walls, to get the same effect. We know that deer can severely alter the composition of our forests, particularly our tree species, and this can have really long-term legacy effects. So based on what those deer find as palatable, what they eat, will then affect what survives from seedling, sapling, and to mature. So we actually see that we get into these larger size classes, the less palatable species are much more numerous. And that reflects decades of deer browse in some of these forests. Next, we can think about actually using strategies to promote some of the ecological functions in our forests. So this is an example of thinking about how we can accelerate the development of our forests. As I mentioned, a lot of our forests are relatively young. In some places, they're really simple. This is an example of white pine. That's it. It's the only species there. They're all the same age. They're pretty close growing, so they're pretty unhealthy. That usually reflects the size of their root systems, very small. There's not a lot going on in the understory because there's no light that reaches that understory. So thinking about ways we can move that forest to a much more complex, diverse system through active management. And there's been great examples of this. So this is an example up in Westford, on the Westford Town Forest in Vermont. Again, this example of this, what we call old field white pine, all the same age, really skinny, tall trees. They're not that healthy, very prone to windfall because they don't have deep root systems. So what the town did with a county forester is go in with some active management and actually create some patches of openings. You can actually see some of this. There's hemlock growing in here. There's yellow birch and paper birch and sugar maple. I saw sugar maple, where is it? Up in the front, and red maple, right? So you went from this single species stand to multiple species. You're creating different layers in the forest, great for birds, great for a lot of wildlife. And you're creating a lot more structure, so leaving things like some dead wood that was a missing component in that forest, just had not developed. Leaving some of the bigger trees just to exist and grow bigger, right? So creating complexity when you didn't have that. And one really awesome benefit of this harvest is that that wood went to the local town, went to a local mill. They built things for it. They put it in the town office. It went to the local community. So really cool impact of doing some good ecological work in the woods and also helping the town and providing local wood products. So another example, this is a landowner near Montpelier, Vermont. Hemlock forest. Again, I talked about how vulnerable hemlock is. And there's nothing going on in this understory. There's not a single small tree. There's not a herb, a shrub, anything. It's highly deer browse, legacy of probably past grazing of domestic animals, sheep or cows in this woods. I see this as a very vulnerable situation because there's nothing to replace the overstory. And so thinking about ways we can create opportunities for regeneration. And this is the Sterling Town Forest in Stowe, Vermont, where they had a very homogeneous forest, and they went in and created these, what we call patch cuts, leaving large legacy trees. This is a beautiful sugar maple here, to spread its seed into that opening. There's also, some beautiful red spruce. Is actually another one off the photo I had to clip out. They left these beautiful healthy dominant trees to be a source of seed and provide that vertical structure. And you have, probably a dozen different species coming up in this forest. Great bird habitat. This is where a lot of birds like to nest and rear their young. And so we heard lots of birds. It was spring migration coming in, really rich site. Other thing I really like to encourage folks to do is think about ways to increase decaying wood in the forest. It's a missing component because of our land use, and decaying wood provides so many benefits to the soil, holds water, restores nutrients, great habitat for insects, birds, bears, all sorts of things. You use dens in these trees. And so we can actually create some of this. It's not perfect mimic of what would happen naturally in what we call a snag here. But folks are experimenting with girdling some of these trees, and you get a tree that's standing dead. It creates light in the canopy, so it gives an opportunity for some regeneration and creates that condition where eventually over time this tree will fall, but it will take a long period of time. Folks are also intentionally felling and leaving logs on the ground. This is an example. You can't really tell, but this is a pretty steep slope. And so felling that log perpendicular to the slope can help control water when it runs off. It can hold back leaves and soil from eroding. So that's a really important thing. It happens naturally in our forests, but a lot of our forests just haven't developed these because they're fairly young. And doing things like repairing these legacies of past land use, we have them in our woods, and I think we have a responsibility to go in and fix them. It does take work to do this, and often going in and fixing these gullies that may have been there for 75, 100 years are now places that are really vulnerable when we think about heavy rain events. What we want is to slow spread and sink water. So we want water to slow down, stay in the woods where it's really can be used and absorbed into the soil, and not cause erosion or go downstream into our towns and cities. And the last practice that I really like, I'm excited about, is this idea of restoring streams, putting wood back into the streams. We actually went in and we took out wood from streams in many cases, or again, in many cases, our forests are just fairly young. They haven't naturally had trees fall in, and so folks are doing this both for fish habitat, but now for climate resiliency, is adding wood back in, and you can see how incised this lower part of the stream is, right, from years and decades of erosion. And so bringing that back up to connect to its floodplain. All right, and the last strategy I wanted to talk about is assisting with forest migration. And this is something I know folks are really interested in tree planting. So just to preface that, it's really challenging. I mentioned that trees can move with a changing climate, but that takes some certain conditions and it takes time. So, seed needs to be able to move to a new favorable location. And it can take decades for a tree to even reach maturity to produce seed. Those conditions have to be favorable. It can't be eaten by a squirrel. It has to land on soil, not asphalt, right? It can't be droughty when that seed tries to germinate, and there can't be other plants that are out competing it. So often that seedling needs light, so it might need a gap in the canopy. I mentioned that with sweet gum, right? So that's really critical for a lot of species. They're not going to come up in the understory where it's really dark and there isn't a lot of sunlight. And so fragmentation and breaking up of that forest landscape can really limit where trees go and what surfaces those seed land on. And so we are worried that the pace of climate change is happening faster than trees can actually move by themselves, and that the landscape might make it hard. And so folks are doing what we call assisted migration, actually intentionally moving species to more favorable locations. And there's sort of three different veins of this. One is kind of moving species within their current range. Maybe you're taking a seed source from the southern part of its range and moving it north, or you could be actually expanding the edge, that northern edge of the range. So that's range migration. And there is some examples of people actually doing assisted species migration. This is a little bit more risky, and it's really for at-risk species that have really specific needs and are going to be lost or potentially extinct without our intervention. This example of researchers at UVM with the state of Vermont actually doing this in a town forest in Hartford, Vermont, where they are intentionally planting some species to see how well they do in these new conditions. And the issue too is when you plant something, it needs to not only survive today's climate, but the future's climate. And so that can make it really hard because we're still gonna get cold weather in the winter. We're gonna get droughts, right? So that tree has to be able to stand today and the future. And so we do have some tools. We have this great tool called the Eastern Seed Zone Map that lets you look at sort of similar climate areas. And so what you would do here, if you wanted to plant in Rhode Island, is you maybe want to find seed from one zone south of you. I cut off that seed zone extends quite a bit more south. And so that can be a helpful way to think about making sure that tree is going to be adapted to both the current and future climate. Right? You don't want to take a tree from Georgia and try to plant it up here. It would not survive our winters. And then another bottleneck is actually getting seed source. And caring for these trees. And I will say this is a growing area of work. Folks are actively recognizing we need a higher diversity of trees to plant in the woods for restoration, and we need a range of genetics within those. We need the folks who can do the work, plant them, but also care for them, protect them from deer browse. And so it's a workforce development need as well. So lots of opportunities for folks to, if you have young people in your life, get involved in tree planting. It's a really important thing that we need. And so just to wrap up, I just want to end on, a positive note about the community of practice that's developed around a lot of this work. There is an extensive network of folks that really care about our forests and a changing climate. There's research that's happening, some here in Rhode Island, to look at adaptive silviculture for climate change. There's these demonstration sites across a lot of different types of landowners, look at different strategies. What can we learn? How can we share this information and the outcomes that we're seeing? Right? It takes a lot of experimentation and creativity. We also have a growing number of resources for landowners. Audubon Vermont, Mass Audubon, lots of Audubon chapters are leading a lot of this work in terms of birds, but they recognize forests and birds need to coexist. I do a lot of work up in Vermont to engage foresters and landowners in understanding and telling stories about what people are doing out in the land. And then along that, we have a lot of resources. So I mentioned the Climate Change Atlas. There's tree planting guides. There's actually a new one coming out very soon about best practices in tree planting. I have a lot of resources that I make for a very general audience about understanding climate change. I brought some of them here. Everything I have is available digitally on my website if you want any of it. All in like PDFs, freely available. And there's so many more resources I could not capture on this slide, but just to show that there's a lot out there, and it's such a growing body of work amongst many scientists, practitioners, landowners, conservation groups that are all coming together for a similar cause and goal. And so I'll end with that. This is the UVM Extension Forestry website. Have a YouTube channel with lots of things, just growing number of resources. I'm always happy to hear from folks if you want to email me after this, and hopefully I can take some of your questions.